Thank you so much for having me. I'm a doctoral candidate at IMT School for Advanced Studies Lucca in Italy in the analysis and management of cultural heritage. I'm currently examining how people moved through and engaged with their urban environments using the case study of Bologna during the 1630-31 plague. I'm fascinated by the lived experience of plague and how spaces themselves shifted meaning. My research has uncovered that the restrictions on mobility were gendered and based on social status, some ideas of which I will share with you now. The anonymous and unrefined image of Via San Mamolo with a plague scene from 1630, a horrifying scene of a plague-ridden street in Bologna, joins a rare genre of images that offer visual clues of the lived experience of Italian early modern epidemics. It is one of only two early modern representations of a Bolognese streetscape during a pandemic, which shows mobile women. To the right of the allegory of death, a woman walks with her staff towards the middle of the street, seemingly disengaged from the surrounding chaos. Beyond her, two women form an audience for a hanging. In contrast to the street goers, the other women in the image are depicted as would be expected, from their windows, watching the activities of men unfold from above. Images that illustrate the mobility of women in times of plague in Italy are few, perhaps because most often women were subjected to greater restrictions to their movements than men. Such was the case for Bologna. The plague of 1630-31 arrived in Bologna from the northern cities of Milan and Venice in May. And from July until January, women were legally obliged to remain inside their homes. These regulations have framed the dominant historical narrative in such a way as to ignore the mobility of women. Yet this image and textual sources demonstrate that despite the initial laws that confine them to their homes, women remained actively involved within their communities, playing key roles in sustaining the local economy and in supporting the well-being of the city as primary caregivers. However, the majority of scholarship has placed women in a peripheral position, devaluing their significant contributions during the epidemic. Moreover, the ways in which movement in the city was facilitated by the roles adopted by some women, while other women were expected to be immobile, has yet to be investigated. The forced quarantining of healthy women was commonly enacted as a precautionary measure during periods of early modern plague. As noted by historian Leanne Whaley, in the early modern period, women were perceived as abnormal in comparison to the normal male. This is evident in Bologna, where the containment of the female body, which was itself treated as a site of contagion, became a primary target of public policy during the 1630-31 outbreak. The legal decree, or bando, published on the 25th of July, 1630, at the peak of the epidemic, and republished consecutively until January 1631, legally obliged women and children to domestic confinement, prohibiting women from traveling to work or engaging in business. In comparison, men could continue to move and operate their businesses unless they were found to be within a household suspected of plague. Furthermore, men never experienced a general quarantine in Bologna. Confinement into the domestic space was part of a process in which women were identified, classified, divided, and imprisoned by the health authorities because of their classification as abnormal. However, the division of all women into one category based on perceived vulnerability did not represent the real need of the healthcare system or the local economy. Exceptions to the overarching rule were quickly created. These necessitated new ways of partitioning women set within a hierarchy, creating divisions based on class and occupation, each with varying access to mobility. Geographer Doreen Massey, whose work has significantly contributed to the field of feminist geography and to our understanding of gendered space, argued in Space, Place, and Gender that degrees of mobility are gendered, in which women and men access, move through, and respond to spaces differently depending on their gendered experience. Moreover, Massey contends that distinct sections of society experience differentiated mobility according to their access to mobility, influenced by social status and wealth. While early modern women experienced varying levels of mobility under normal circumstances, during periods of epidemics, female mobility became contingent on being placed outside the category of woman into new classifications under law based on occupation and social status. Woman was substituted for new divisions such as calderane, infermiera, barbiera, and gentildonna, with disciplinary action administered according to social standing. This presentation aims to illustrate how entering these new categories afforded women the agency to maintain their household economy and temporarily overcome social and physical barriers, demonstrating great resilience in moments of crisis. Through a collection of contemporary textual sources, I first address how the movement of women was differentiated according to social standing. Then I considered the fundamental work of women in the silk industry and in the plague hospitals, known as lazzaretti, occupational roles that awarded various degrees of mobility. The quarantine rules outlined in the July Bando prohibited women and children from traveling away from the home, but did not extend to those who traveled by carriage, assuming they resided in a home that had been free of plague for 1 month. The carriage, an enclosed space that provided barriers to the putrid airs of the disease, was conceptualized as a safe space, but was only for those who could afford to own or to hire a carriage. Women themselves experienced differentiated mobility with major disparities in access to mobility. For instance, prostitutes were prohibited to travel by carriage, demonstrating how the laws specifically targeted marginalized groups of women. By December, a new bando revoked all travel permits for women, even those who had previously enjoyed the right to travel by carriage, except for noble women. Now only noble women could use the carriage and could now even travel with female companions from other households, thus experiencing an increase in mobility. The body of the noble woman was afforded more legal rights to move through the city during a pandemic. Furthermore, the perceived cleanliness of the noble female body extended to her chosen female companions. The aristocratic body carried an elite social and legal status, but also a physical superiority that could be rubbed off on others. While these specific exclusions to confinement only benefited elite women, alternative types of mobility were experienced exclusively by women who worked in the silk arts. Bologna's silk industry had a commanding position in the European silk market because of its unique methods of production and thus employed approximately 1/3 of the city's population. Bologna's famous hydraulic-powered machines reduced hard labor, providing more employment for women, who comprised about 84% of the workforce. Women employed as calderane worked in the reeling process, an aspect of production that necessitated women to travel to the silk mills. Within a few days of the bando requiring women to remain inside their homes, a new regulation came into effect, citing how the previous law had been prejudicial against the silk arts. It introduced a special exemption for women who worked as calderane, permitting these women to obtain a health certificate in order to continue to work. These exemptions highlight the importance of the silk industry in Bologna and the influence that large industry had within government decision-making. Given the seasonal nature of the silk industry, it was essential over the summer months, at the peak of the epidemic, that production continued. In particular, the women who made up the largest portion of the employees were paramount in the continuation of the industry, but also in the maintenance of their household economies, which relied on this seasonal work. Their positions allowed them to travel to work, but otherwise they were prohibited to freely move throughout the city. Similarly, women who volunteered to work in the plague hospitals were authorized to leave their homes, but entered a new kind of enclosure. The lazzaretti in Bologna were religious houses converted into temporary hospitals and resided outside the walls of the ancient city in close proximity to each other, fortified with large gates and guarded around the clock. The two main hospitals were known as Angeli, dedicated to sick men, and Annunziata, which housed sick women. According to Bologna's College of Medicine, women were only authorized to undertake positions as midwives and occasionally as suppliers of remedies. However, epidemics provided chances for unlicensed women to legally practice as healthcare workers. Textual sources reveal that in July, women made up approximately 30 to 40% of the workforce in the two main plague hospitals, assuming such duties as nurses, laundresses, cooks, dispensers of remedies, and even a surgeon. These initial records reveal how the strict division of labor was gendered. The role of a laundress was solely for women, while doctors, apothecaries, and body carriers were exclusively male. However, both men and women are listed as nurses, dispensers of medicine, and as cooks. Within the hospitals, the direct care of the sick fell to the barber surgeons and nurses, with a particular reliance on marginalized people to fill support roles. For instance, it was a common practice for early modern Italian cities to offer commuted sentences for prisoners in exchange for their service in the lazzaretti. A record of employees in Bologna's hospitals from the 30th of December, 1630, lists 2 male prisoners and a female imprisoned prostitute. Other prostitutes are recorded. Chronicler Moratti argued that the prostitutes who served at Bologna's hospitals were persuaded to this service not from charity, but from greediness for profit. His contemporary gaze calls attention to the prejudice that marginalized women face, also evident in the public health policies. From July 1st, brothels were closed and prostitutes and female beggars were prohibited from exiting the city, their movement considered a threat to public health. Facing unemployment, work in the hospital offered an opportunity to survive. This was the case for former prostitute Susanna Ricci, who was recorded to have worked in the San Giuseppe Hospital as a barbiera, a barber surgeon, exclusively treating women. This title was normally restricted to men and shows the respect she earned for her healing talent. The plague year permitted her temporary occupational status under the category of barbiera, providing her with momentary social mobility when otherwise she was banned from practicing her skills. In the lazzaretti, unlicensed female practitioners acquired new levels of freedom when their social category temporarily changed meaning. Such was the case when ex-prostitutes became infermiera or barbiera. These occupational categories excluded women from the quarantine restrictions and permitted them brief shifts in the physical and social mobility, but with great personal risk. Mobility here was limited, as the women who worked in the lazzaretti were confined in new ways by the gated and guarded hospital structure. The 1630-31 outbreak in Bologna is exemplary of the ways in which the female body was segmented and controlled under Italian early modern health policies in times of plague. The categorization of the female body as abnormal created an environment in which women were primary targets for health policies during epidemics, which separated healthy women from the public spaces of the city, confining them to their homes. Access to mobility in periods of plague was gendered and contingent on exiting the category of woman and entering fresh categories formed from social class and occupation. These classifications permitted more freedom, simultaneously introducing women to new categories of exclusion with varying degrees of mobility. prostitutes and peasants, nurses and noble women could each cross the boundaries of domestic imprisonment, but only to be confronted with new forms of containment. The vital contributions made by women through work in local industry and in the lazzaretti shines light on the agency and resilience of individual women in moments of crisis, demonstrating that the ability to move, to travel, and to navigate the horrors of this event was deeply discriminative. Mobility was gendered, classist, and conditional, issues that continue to be relevant in the 21st century global pandemic in which we find ourselves today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Natalie. An excellent paper, and exactly to 15 minutes. So I didn't need to worry about time. Well done.
Thank you.
We are going to move on. We're moving on chronologically. So we're heading now from 1630 into the 18th century, and into briefly into the 19th as well. And Ella, whenever you're ready, it's over to you.
Okay, I was just gonna time myself so I don't. Okay, actually, my screen. Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Ella Sbaraini and I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. Before I begin, I wanted to warn people that my paper involves an in-depth discussion of suicide, and so I want to make it very clear that people should feel able to leave at any time. Suicides always happen somewhere. They always happen in a particular space. Suicidal people often think in depth about the space in which they will end their lives and about the space to which they are going after death. But despite the so-called spatial turn in history having got underway in the 1990s, historians of suicide have yet to look at the spatial context of suicide in this period. Partly, this is because historians have often been more interested in studying the cultural, legal, and religious responses to suicide, rather than the experiences and actions of suicidal people themselves, so including the act and space of death itself. The field's most seminal work, Michael MacDonald and Terence Murphy's Sleepless Souls, which I've put here on the left, is really a meta-narrative about a shift in legal, religious, and cultural positions on suicide, and has really set the agenda for most subsequent Anglophone histories. And I've got Ira Houston's Punishing the Dead on the right, which is really a response, or it really takes its position from Sleepless Souls, really. And that's just one of many. My PhD aims to focus instead on the people who die, to look at their emotional and physical experiences. Part of this is thinking about the materiality and spatiality of suicide. So in this paper, I will first look at how people talked about space in their suicide letters, which are a really important source for me. I will then talk more about the actual spaces in which people chose to end their lives in this period. Suicidologists have long proposed that suicide is, in part, a communicative act, which is not only centered on ending life, but also on expressing something. And I think looking at space can be one way of accessing potential communicative aspects. This paper also proposes fundamentally that the materiality of space had a direct impact upon the experience of suicide. So, suicide letters, both original suicide letters, which I've generally found sort of slip between the pages of coroner's inquests or in family papers, and printed letters, which were published in newspapers after inquests, might seem very strange to us, but it was fairly common for people's suicide letters to be published in the press, show that suicidal people often thought about their space of suicide. In 1823, the North Wales Gazette reported that an unnamed man had killed himself in Coham, a hamlet near Bristol, and had written a message on the walls of a decaying building there. He expressed that, "This gloomy mansion will suit my purpose well. It invites me to revel in despair and cast one more reflection on this world of woes, this vale of tears. I am a stranger to the adjacent city, but well known in most watering places. This shall be my last watering place. This man thus aligned his death with the space of the gloomy mansion, which well suited his act of suicide. Though his letter was particularly unequivocal, others also clearly thought about where they would end their lives. In her suicide letter, Mary Wollstonecraft, who attempted suicide twice, but didn't die from suicide, wrote that she shall plunge into the Thames, whereas the least chance of my being snatched from the death I seek, clearly seeing the space of the Thames and the method of drowning as particularly suited to her desire for death. Similarly, the young Alice Varney wrote in her suicide letter that I am resolved a watery grave this night to have. I'll plunge myself into the deep living in. A milk-white dove over my watery tomb shall fly. There yon you will find my body lied. Despite her shaky spelling, Varney's language is really poignant, poetic. With her watery grave, she did indeed drown herself, figuring really strongly as a space of death, which would then become a tomb for her body. I also think it's quite interesting that both Wollstonecraft and Varney use the word plunge to describe entering the river as like a really quite visceral, physical verb for kind of entering that space of suicide. I just think it's interesting to note that. In other letters, reflections on the place of suicide became intermingled with considerations of the space to which they would be going after death. Before he died, George Davis asked his friend to look after his possessions, as they will not be of any use to me, for I am going I know not where, but I will believe it will be a watery grave. I have his suicide letter shown here on the screen, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And while he thought that he would drown himself then, Davis's future place, his where, was thus uncertain, with this sort of subaqueous space of his grave being superseded by a new and unknown placidness somewhere else. Indeed, while the place of suicide was clearly considered in letters, it was more common for suicidal people to discuss the place they were going after death, often with considerable uncertainty. Before he shot himself in London in 1768, Frederick Prestroff wrote out verses from two different poems, one in English and one in French, which expressed ambiguity about one's place after death. The English poem talked of that unknown somewhere in the skies, say where that unknown somewhere lies, clearly reflecting on the uncertainty of the post-suicidal space. This obscurity surrounding the where of the afterlife could provoke different emotions. Some, like Matthew Nugent, who killed himself in 1847, merely hoped that it would be better than this place on earth. Nugent's suicide letter expressed that he had seen too much of mankind ever to expect to be happy in this world. I will therefore try what sort of place is in the next, contrasting his earthly space with another posthumous realm. Others, like Michael Titchmarsh, a newspaper editor who drowned himself in London in 1840, felt really worried about where they were going. He wrote in his suicide letter that, before you receive this, I shall be, ask not where, my mind shudders to think where. It's notable that the terms place and where were really common in these reflections, indicating that people thought of the afterlife partly as a space. It was a realm where suicidal people also, sometimes, hoped others would join them in the future, with James Philip O'Neill writing that, if I should chance to get into the Elysian fields, I will keep you a good place, and John Watkins Nimmo similarly expressing that, we shall meet again perhaps, in a better place. As Olivia Stevenson notes, a suicidologist, suicide should be understood partly as an embodied and spatialized journey from the suicidal to an envisioned post-suicidal space. This sense of embarkation was sometimes explicitly captured in the letters, with Nimmo expressing that, I have joked frequently about taking journeys, but never till now did I anticipate so long a one as I shall be performing when this reaches you, with suicide thus depicted as a long, perhaps difficult, traversal of place and dimension. In what actual spaces were people most likely to begin such a journey? The sources offer particularly rich evidence for exploring this question. I use a large number of coroner's inquests, which are inquiries into the cause of a suspicious death, such as a suicide or an accident. And I've got a picture of an early 19th century coroner's inquest here. These usually happened 1 to 3 days after the death, often in a nearby inn or in the place where the person died. Witnesses who were close to the deceased or who found the body, so they didn't necessarily know the deceased, but who actually first encountered their body, were asked to give evidence about the cause of death and, in cases of suicide, the state of mind of the deceased, because there's two different verdicts, or two main verdicts that you have in cases of suicide, non compos mentis and fallo de se, which are basically about the sanity of the deceased when they died, and they have particular legal significance. As it was standard practice for jurors to ask witnesses how and where people were discovered after or during their suicides, all coroner's inquests, which have surviving depositions, the ones that are useful for what I'm doing really, describe in greater or lesser detail the spatial contexts in which people killed themselves. So what I'm saying is you actually always basically have a sense of where this person died, where they were found, and where they were enacting their deaths, essentially, kind of ingrained in the material itself. Inquests also often portray the difficulty that witnesses encountered in trying to uncover the suicidal space. Indeed, finding an act of suicide was often depicted as a really difficult process of uncovering and discovery, with concerned friends and neighbours conscripting associates and even just passers-by in trying to access this space. This is because the vast majority of suicides happened in private, with around 35% of suicides occurring behind a locked or bolted door. I haven't yet analysed all of my data, but it seems to be around this figure, and around 85% taking place while the suicidal person was, at least initially, completely alone. Since people often took poison or cut their throats when completely by themselves, but were found by others as they died from their injuries. So the act of suicide is generally happening in private. There are some cases where people kill themselves in front of others, but they're quite rare. The inquest of Nicholas Weigel, who hanged himself in London in 1766, is really typical of the way in which witnesses recounted the intimate human experience of uncovering the suicidal space, an extract of which I've put on screen. I'm not going to read it out, it's quite long, but it really it's very typical of this kind of effort to access a suicidal space and to find out what's happened, essentially. This tendency in the inquests for people to describe in great detail the effort that went into unlocking the locked space of suicide is because, partly, there was legal significance placed on the solitariness of this space. Indeed, it showed that the deceased alone were responsible for their death, so it wasn't something like a murder. But a locked space did not, of course, only have legal and social significance for witnesses. It was clearly something which suicidal people sought. This was partly because privacy allowed people to follow through with their suicides without interference, and I also use records of attempted suicides, which show how common it was, unsurprisingly perhaps, particularly in a culture where suicide is very taboo, for people to try to prevent suicide and prevent people dying by their own hand, essentially. In his spiritualist biography, writer and hymnist William Calper described his many attempts at suicide in 1763 and explained that he had tried to find a solitary space in order to complete the act. He detailed how he repaired to my room and, having shut both the inner and outer door, prepared myself for the last scene of the tragedy, was planning to poison himself. Having poured the laudanum into a basin, he was then interrupted by his laundress, so he started up hastily, dressed myself, hid the basin, and, affecting as composed an air as I could, walked out into the dining room. While entering the communal space of the dining room, Calper therefore performed a state of composure, hiding his anguished emotions from any potential observers. It was only in a solitary space where he could complete his suicide. And Calper attempted suicide many times in a short space of time. And he really describes in great detail what that experience was like for him. And shortly after this time, he describes trying to hang himself and describes trying to lock the door. And he really emphasizes this because he didn't actually lock it. And he sees this as God intervening in trying to protect his life, because he sees the potentiality of people being able to get into that space as indicative of God's effort to stop his suicide. And so he himself places great significance on privacy and the locking of this door. Of course, privacy was not always a feature of the suicidal space, or if it was not the only significant element. While people generally chose a solitary space to enact their suicides, they also often knew that it would later be occupied by others, and that their dead body could communicate something to them. Spaces were thus sometimes chosen which had social, emotional, or occupational significance. A considerable number of suicides occurred in people's workplaces, and this was more common if they'd been experiencing difficulties with their employers. For example, in 1783, James Graffes wrote a suicide letter on the shutters of his master's workshop in Maidstone, which the coroner's clerk then transcribed, explaining that he'd been mistreated by his master and his wife. He also, however, hanged himself in the workshop itself and was found by his colleague. In this way, the occupational space was not only inscribed with his final message of disdain and anger, but marked with his dead body, the clearest manifestation of his suffering. Of course, people did not always have a lot of choice about their space of suicide. In extreme cases, people were forced to end their lives in places of confinement. Anne Norris was a workhouse inmate who was particularly mentally unwell and had long been in and out of madhouses. Due to her uncontrollability, Norris was shut in a hole where the disordered people are usually put in the workhouse. This is in London. As one of the workhouse nurses explained, she saw Norris 3 times in the hole when she wanted to get out, the door being bolted on the outside, but deponent could not properly open it as the deceased was confined there by the governor to prevent her escaping again, as deponent believes. During that time, the hole was the only place in which Norris was able to kill herself. Though this is a really extreme, really sad example, it demonstrates how the vulnerable and marginalised could be really limited in where they could end their lives, or indeed even driven to suicide by spaces of confinement or mistreatment. But in many other, less extreme examples, suicidal people were more quietly and subtly delimited by where they could end their lives. Undoubtedly, some people travelled far in order to kill themselves, perhaps because they had a strong sense of where they wanted to die. The labourer George Dengate travelled nearly 40 miles west of his home in East Guildford, which would have taken at least 12 hours by foot, to hang himself on a tree on Gallows Bank near Lewes. At this time, Gallows Bank was a key site in which criminals of the county were hanged. Perhaps Dengate thought it was a symbolically significant place for his own self-inflicted death. Mostly, however, unless they were foreigners or itinerant visitors, people killed themselves close to where they lived. As such, the material and environmental conditions of local space created particular geographic differences in the spaces of suicide. London's dense, higgledy-piggledy built environment and the greater tendency for people to occupy their own small lodgings meant there were more suicides in people's private lodging rooms. Equally, the deep and dangerous River Thames and Hyde Park's large basin also meant that there was a considerable number of drownings. Whitehaven, I've pictured it here, a small coastal town within a locality surrounded by rivers, also experienced a really high number of drownings. The inquisitions overseen by the Ipswich coroner covered a sizable stretch of rural Suffolk that I've looked at. Accordingly, I found more hangings in barns and from the boughs of trees. In Bath, which had very high buildings, this is part of the reason why I think I'm not 100% sure. There were an unusually large number of people who threw themselves out of windows, which was generally a very unusual way for people to end their lives in this period. What I'm trying to get at is that the spatiality and materiality of place that's really had an important impact upon the physical experience of suicide. And this is really borne out statistically in the inquests that I've analysed. I hope this brief paper has given you a sense, I hope, of the importance of place in people's discussions of their own suicides and in conditioning how suicide was experienced in this period. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ella. Incredibly powerful paper, and good to see the sort of the virtual coffee there as well. So we will get in touch. I should say, if anybody wants to, as we go through, put any questions into the chat, we can pick those up towards the end. But we are going to move forward, well, moving to the present, but also looking backwards, because our final paper is going to consider doing public history in a pandemic. So Barbara, it's over to you.
So I'm Barbara Crosbie. I'm an assistant professor at Durham, or a lecturer as we used to be called. And I also moonlight as a public historian now, working on a project entitled The Body on Killhope Moor. And today I really want to talk to you more than anything about public history and doing public history during a pandemic. So to start with, I think it'll be helpful if I briefly explain what exactly it is that I mean by public history. As this is, I think, rather an ambiguous term. In its widest sense, it's no more than history done by academically trained professionals that's presented to the public, whoever we think the public might be. But public history is not simply a question of dissemination, of taking research out into the public arena and making it accessible to non-expert audiences, although obviously this is an important aspect of what we do as historians. Instead, public history can, and I think maybe I'm coming to think should, be a participatory activity that blurs the divide between professional historians and the untrained public. And this can lead to projects in which people have agency over their own pasts, and the project that I'm going to talk about today most definitely fits into this second category. What's more, this was not a case of me inviting the public to get engaged in a research project that I'd devised. This was not a topic that I, as a trained historian, had deemed to be something that they, the public, should or would be interested in. Instead, this was a project dreamed up by Drama in the Dale, a community interest company based in Upper Weardale, and they had secured funding from the Lottery's Heritage Fund before they even began to look for a historian to help them with their research. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you about Drama in the Dale and their excellent project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research and the practicalities of actually doing history during a pandemic, but also I want to discuss the value of public history when it comes to unearthing and transmitting the memories that are woven into the landscape in which people live. Excellent. Sorry, I'm having problems moving the screen there. So Drama in the Dale is a thriving community theatre group that has developed something of a reputation for creating high quality performances in unusual locations. Although the pandemic was not on their agenda when they won funding for their most ambitious project to date, outdoor performances certainly lend themselves to this new socially distanced world in which we inhabit. In fact, such outdoor theatre has become quite popular as a needs-must alternative venue. Whereas for Drama in the Dale, this has always been integral to what they do, which gives their work a sense of being rooted in the very dramatic landscape in which they operate. Up until now, they've performed other people's plays, but this project was different in that they were commissioning a play based upon a local story. And this local story was about the body on Killhope Moor. This body was found in 1921, and so they wanted to mark the centenary of this event, and they planned to investigate the finding of the body and its burial, write a play and perform it on the moor, or to be more precise, in the grounds of Killhope Minor Museum with the moor as their backdrop, and then to create an exhibition at the museum to complement the play. I have to say, this was such a fantastic sounding project that I took on the role of research mentor last October with a huge level of enthusiasm and excitement. And I adopted an air of professional confidence, I think it's fair to say, as I reassured the directors of drama in the Dale that everything would be fine if we had to start the project online, which was looking ever more likely. Teaching online in Durham by this time was in full swing, so I could truthfully claim that I knew what I was doing, even if in reality I had this huge underlying anxiety that things might come crumbling down around me. This was, I assumed, going to be easier for the playwright, David Natalie, who was running parallel creative writing workshops. But how was I going to run weekly workshops online with no access to archives, no field trips, and no coffee breaks to get to know people? I guessed at first it was going to be okay because I could begin by laying the foundations. We could explore evidence that had already been amassed by Liz, one of the Drama in the Dale team, along with any online material that we could locate, whilst we figured out what it was we wanted to do once the museums and archives reopened. So when I wrote the first few of the weekly research blogs for the website, I still thought archival sessions would take place. Little did I know, in fact, little did any of us know, that we wouldn't actually meet each other until June, by which time the research was complete, the play was written, and the rehearsals had begun. And this is just some of the research group getting to meet each other for the first time. I have to say, one of the things we were really struck by was how tall each of us were, because we'd only ever seen each other sitting down in Zoom meetings, and we'd had preconceived ideas about whether or not we were short at all, it would seem, and we'd all done this. So this we'd gone along to see some of the early rehearsals in a disused quarry that's now a local nature reserve. So as it became obvious that Plan A was not going to be possible, everything had to be reconsidered. Firstly, we paid Durham Record Office to photograph some documents that we'd found on their online catalogues. And the group started to work on identifying people with relevant knowledge and applying them for whatever we could extract in the way of useful information. And I have to say that on the whole, most people were wonderfully generous with their time and knowledge. And I'm not going to begin to single out individuals here, as the list is actually very long and I'd be bound to miss out some people. But suffice to say that we got help from historians, archaeologists, curators, archivists, members of history and archaeology societies, the church commissioners, the local police, and members of the local community. They gave us advice, provided us with evidence, suggested online material that we might find helpful, and pointed us to other people who may be able to assist. Now, all of this was combined with a wealth of knowledge that the group members brought to the project, from a local historian and fell walker, an engineer, a dietitian, a retired school teacher who seems to know absolutely everybody in the community, a recent archaeology graduate, those with experience of working in heritage projects in Durham, and others with knowledge of tailoring and knitting, and one with the ability to attract the attention of thousands on Facebook, amongst many other skills. So working alongside people with such a broad skill set was so different to my more usual solitary endeavours. And I would actually recommend engaging in public history for this experience alone. And I also have to say that in contrast to some student seminars on Zoom, there was absolutely no difficulty in getting this group to talk. It should also be noted that I was employed as a research mentor, and this was very much how I introduced myself to the group, as their research assistant, not the other way around. But in the end, in truth, we ended up working as a group, and I contributed my opinions alongside everybody else on an equal basis. I think at this point, it's probably a good place to introduce you to some of the basic information about the body that was at the centre of this project. For those of you that have no idea where Upper Weardale is, it's about as remote as England gets. And I think rather ironically, in many ways, this landscape became the central character of the research, whilst we were all trapped in cyberspace. To be more precise, the location of the find was Killhope Moor, close to where the three counties of Durham, Northumberland and Cumbria meet. And as you'll see from this picture of a scouting group that we sent out that ventured out there to see what the landscape was like, this is not the sort of place where you decide to bury a body on a whim. It's very rough terrain, and recent conservation work to restore the peat hags means that the landscape is pretty much as it would have been when the body was buried and when it was found. So it was found in 1921 by a local shepherd after the coffin that it was buried in was partially exposed by torrential rainfall. The coffin itself was described as rough-hewn, and it had a top like a house roof. And because it was in a peat bog, it was reasonably well preserved. The content of the coffin, as described at the time, we had a male corpse, which they felt unable to age, with flaxen hair of about 8 inches in length, a leaden bullet, which appeared to fall from the shoulder area when the body was lifted from the coffin. This body lacked its lower jaw, and most of the reports mentioned that it had very neat fingernails. And I don't know whether you can make out here, but in the top corner of the screen there is actually an image of the fingernail. This is a very poor reproduction, which is the only image of the pictures that were taken at the time that we've managed to locate. The corpse was wrapped in a blanket, somewhat like a shroud. And underneath this blanket, it was wearing a frock coat with a very wide skirt. It had buttons, which again you can see in this image, which we've managed to date to the mid-18th century. It was wearing a vest or waistcoat, knitted stockings with seams up the back. The boots were hand-stitched, and rather curiously, this body had no shirt nor trousers or a kilt. I think, needless to say, in many respects, this attracted the attention of the local the media at the time, and it got plenty of news coverage far and wide. There were a few alternative explanations, but the general consensus at the time was this was probably a Jacobite soldier who'd been injured in the 1745 rebellion. The coffin and some of the clothing was apparently kept when the body was reburied in a local cemetery, but we've been unable to track down any of the artifacts or the original photographs. And this is despite considerable help from local museums, archives, archivists, the church, and even the local police. Frustratingly, I think the most likely resting place for these objects is what was Durham County Museum, and these collections are currently in storage awaiting their new home in Durham's new history centre. But even I think if we had found some of these objects, the truth is the mystery of the burial would almost inevitably remain a mystery. Nonetheless, given the range of circumstantial evidence that we've amassed, we've also concluded that this was most likely a casualty of the 45. However, today I don't want to focus on the findings and the research per se, as much as the process of doing research in a broader sense. When I was asked to pitch my ideas for the exhibition to Drama in the Dell at the very beginning of our relationship, my strapline was one body with 3 stories to tell. And the key thing I said I wanted people to take away from any exhibition that we put on would be that the body connects 3 communities living in the same space at different times, and when the body was buried, when it was found, and now as we investigated it. And I also wanted to emphasize that the research was a collective endeavor that unearthed the past, and in doing so created new layers of shared memory. In my teaching, if not my research, I'm used to working with and thinking about sources from the early modern period in which people were embedding community practice within the landscape. I'm thinking here about the work of Nicola White and Andy Wood. And for example, the ways in which people reenacted community boundaries through the practice of beating the bounds or perambulation, mapping out the social landscape as they wove together community memories and passed them down to younger generations. This was an understanding of the social and physical landscape that was rooted in the past with an eye to the future. And I guess that this was influential in my thinking as I approached this project. And so, if you think about the landscape where the body was buried, to an outsider, this may look like any other bit of moorland. But for locals, this is a boundary between 3 counties, and it's also the last resting place for an unknown soul. And I think the idea of the body connecting three distinct communities that had lived at different times in this same landscape not only caught the imagination of the directors of drama in the Dale, but also of the volunteers in the research group and those in the writing group. To paraphrase one of the researchers, when it comes to the bicentenary, future generations will look afresh at the body on Killhope Moor, and we will be pieces in the jigsaw. But I guess it's fair to say that despite a theoretical understanding of the historically laid social landscape, I'd never quite appreciated the extent to which doing history is a social process. And this brings me to my next point. Public history makes you reevaluate what doing history is. I'd been forced out of my comfort zones. I was unable to hide away in an archive. I was mentoring others, not directing my own research. I didn't decide what was worthy to research. We all did. And individual volunteers looked at things that interested them most. And this could make the project quite unwieldy and difficult to manage. But I think there were far more benefits than drawbacks. But then I got the copy of the script of the play. And my initial response was, it's not actually about the history. And I have to admit that I was a little frustrated. Maybe I wasn't actually suited to group endeavours after all. It had been great fun working with a diverse range of people interested in history, but I wasn't so sure anymore about a collaboration with creative writers or even thespians. In other words, it turns out it's very difficult to turn off an academic mindset. For sure, there's very little, if any, of the factual information about the body in the play, but that's not the same as saying it's not about the history. It all depends on how you define history. And as I strayed even further from my comfort zone, I had to go beyond an acceptance that not everyone with an interest in history is an academically trained historian. And I was now coming to recognise that there's more than one way to do history. In an article that appeared in the Observer this weekend, as I was trying to decide what I would say today, Madeleine Pellin emphasised the need to embrace imperfections in costume dramas and to recognise that history is a form of storytelling. And as Hilda Keane has suggested, as practitioners of public history, we must be willing to explore different ways of configuring the relationship between the past and the present. And so, as I looked at the play afresh, I realised it tells stories about what might have happened, what gossip might have spread, what consequences might have occurred. And interestingly, the landscape is actually still a central character in the play, the same as it is in the research. And once I got over my knee-jerk response, I realised that the creative writing team had given voice to memories blowing in the wind in a desolate moor top in Upper Weardale, and that this helps to bring the research alive in a way that the exhibition never could have on its own. And so I think our evidence-based exhibition and their flights of fancy complement each other as we bring the past into sharp focus. So, to sum up, the body on Killhope Moor was surely not a murder victim. He was not unceremoniously dumped, but elaborately buried in a coffin. What we can say for certain is that he didn't bury himself, so others were involved. The location was off the beaten track, not somewhere where you might be passing as you carried a coffin to the nearest churchyard. So we can discount the idea that it was abandoned for whatever reason en route to consecrated ground. In fact, it wasn't really en route to anywhere. The spot was, it would seem, a deliberate choice. So why the secret burial, or more accurately, what or who were the mourners hiding from and why? The circumstantial evidence keeps pointing back to the Jacobite fighting in the region, in the area in 1745, but we'll never know for sure. And maybe this is what makes the body on Killhope Moor such an intriguing story, one in which we're free to imagine and to speculate. But in investigating this mystery, we've discovered so much about the people who have lived and worked in the moorlands in Upper Weardale. And in the very act of doing so, we have written a new chapter in the story of the body on Killhope Moor. We've kept the memory alive and we're passing it on to younger generations. In other words, we've added a new layer of memories to those that have shaped this landscape over the centuries. And I've learned to be less precious about my research. History doesn't belong exclusively to the academically trained historian, and collaborating with those outside of academic institutions makes for an enriching experience. and a richer sense of our shared past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. An incredibly thought-provoking paper. One of three incredibly thought-provoking papers. I, for one, am looking forward to seeing where all three of these projects end up. So thank you all the speakers. Thank you to everyone that's asked questions. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening. That's it for today, and hopefully we'll see some of you again tomorrow.